Hey everyone, welcome back to the Psychology of Business podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me in my virtual studio is Dr. Ellen Reinhart. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good today. I'm excited to talk about, one, your paper, but also talk about you. So before I introduce you, before we talk about the topic, I came across your paper through just kind of a general announcement from the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So Ellen here, she came out with a paper that was actually an outgrowth of her dissertation on how people feel like they contribute to society. So do people feel like different types of service are valued differently? So if I'm someone who just serves in my home, maybe helping, a family member versus if I'm going out and serving in the community, society values that differently. And I think that's something that we can all relate to. We all have family members. We're all trying to do good. We're all trying to serve. We all have our limitations. And this is something that I just personally really related to. So before we talk about that, Ellen, could you tell us a little bit about your background? Who are you? Where are you from? What's your educational background? And what are you doing today?
Absolutely. Yes. And I just want to start by saying thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited for this conversation and to get to kind of bounce some of these ideas around together. So yes, I'm from Ohio, I guess, which is represented by this poster behind me. Grew up in the Midwest, and then in undergrad, I went to Haverford College out near Philadelphia, which has a strong social justice component, really focused on how can we improve the world in these different ways with an eye towards social inequality. And that context, I went there to be an English major, but was really open to a lot of different perspectives. And just by the time I went to declare my major, realized I had taken more psychology classes than English classes because those are the classes I took for fun because they were interesting. And then realized that could be a major. And then I learned about research. And then I learned that that could be a potential career. And just without any planning, just fell in love with the discipline. And for me, social science research broadly, I find fascinating to use the scientific method to try to understand something as complicated as how people think and interact and feel and move through this world. And so that I kind of fell in love with like the methods and with this social justice approach. So I did an undergraduate thesis and got to know more about the research process. And after undergrad, just wanted to do more. So I went out to Stanford to do an RA-ship at Stanford's business school. And then from there, it was a lab manager in the psychology department instead of a think tank, it's a do tank. So it's a group that takes social psych findings and applies them to real world problems. And just the further I got into the research world, the more I wanted to learn and to try to contribute. And so I did my PhD at Stanford in social psychology, working with Hazel Marcus primarily, but also a few other folks, Jennifer Eberhardt, Greg Walton in the department. And that is what kind of led me here. And now I am a postdoc scholar at MSU, Michigan State University, in the Department of Communication. And I can talk more about why I'm excited about being in comm at this point, but that's a little bit about my path here.
Awesome. So yeah, let's talk about it. So that's a broad range. So from English to psychology to Stanford Business School to social psychology. Why are you doing communication now?
Yes. So I am really interested in this idea that we'll get more into of who gets to feel like they contribute to society and what do we as a culture consider contributions. And a piece of that question is, what does it mean to communicate to someone that what they do matters, that they're contributing, that they're a valuable member of our common society? And to me, a way to answer that question is through communication. It's through individual, interactions between two people. It's about institutional messages that can convey if someone is contributing or not, or what they're doing matters and is valued. So that angle and being in this space with folks who are experts in communication is what really drew me to that area to try to answer some of those questions.
So one thing that I'm an organizational behavior researcher. My dissertation advisor, he was actually a social psychologist, but had kind of moved into the business world. So there's a lot of overlap. But me, whenever I do studies, my research is always centered on employees and organizations and business. When you do your research, is there kind of a context that you focus it in? Because every time I think of research, it's within the walls of an organization, a business. So when you do your research, what's kind of the context you're looking at there?
Interesting question. I I'm interested in a lot of different contexts. I'm interested in organizational contexts. I'm interested in more kind of like family dynamic context at
Mhm.
big levels around culture change. I think the common thread in what kind of grounds the work is the cultural perspective. Cultural meaning I'm interested in trying to understand how big ideas in our US culture, for example, around what is good, what's moral, what's right, how those affect institutions such as our media, our government, our schools, how those affect our interactions with each other, and then seep down to individual psychology and then all back up that cycle. So that's the perspective I'm bringing, but I'm genuinely interested in kind of research across all those different levels.
So let's talk about your paper. Do you want to give us an introduction to, your dissertation, what got you interested in this, and then maybe a brief overview of your paper? So it's called Who Feels They Contribute to U.S. Society, Helping Behaviors and Social Class Disparities and Perceived Contributions, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology.
Absolutely. So maybe I'll start with kind of how this project came to be. So I was a first year graduate student taking classes, doing a lot of different work, preparing to TA. And I got a little bit down on myself, really questioning if I was doing what I came to grad school to do. I had written in my essays, it was a rather lofty goal. And my final sentence said, I, I aim to make I aim to contribute to science and society. So I really wanted to come to graduate school to try to make some difference. And as a first year graduate student, I wasn't sure that I was. And I had a phenomenal advisor. So I came to Hazel Marcus and said, kind of brought these concerns to her, and it opened up a question and discussion for us of, well, what constitutes a meaningful contribution? Is it only really kind of like big, broad types of work, or is it can be more local types of contribution? So that it was a little bit of a crisis might be a strong word, but a questioning I had in early graduate school that helped open this up for me. And combined with then when I really started to dive into the literature, I noticed a few different things, different trends. So I noticed that there had been reported this social class disparity in perceived contribution. So people in lower social class context, so people with on average less income, less education, less access to wealth, were reporting that they were less certain that their everyday activities were valuable to society and seen as contributing. So I noticed that finding. I also noticed in the kind of pro-social literature that there's a lot of uh, focus on volunteering and helping strangers and donating to charities, and that's often more accessible for people in these higher social class contexts. But then there's this entire other literature of social support and caregiving, caring for our close others and our loved ones. And that type of labor ends up being more common in lower social class contexts. So putting all of this together, it felt like a conundrum. It wasn't making sense to me. I was trying to understand, well, if there's this social class disparity, maybe that has something to do with the different ways we're valuing some of these helping behaviors. And that's what kind of brought me into this research paradigm.
Hmm. So there are two things I want to say there. One, the imposter syndrome or that crisis you're feeling. I think that's a common and almost necessary thing that people have to go through in grad school. I think when you first get there, you're like, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to do everything. And then after your first couple of semesters, you're like, I don't know if I'm even going to finish this degree. Should I, what should I do? Um,
Exactly.
and then, by the end, you do have something valuable that you can put out there. But two, I think the idea of social class disparity when it comes to helping behaviors is something anyone can relate to, because I think we all have family, like I was saying before, we all have friends, we all want to help out and do more. But obviously if you donate millions of dollars and have a building or a department or a school named after you, that's going to be a lot more visible than you
Mm-hmm.
helping your elderly mother, elderly someone who just needs a little bit more help. So how did you assess this disconnect there? How did you continue on with your study? What made you want to pursue this as a dissertation?
Yes. So is this a good time to maybe get into some of the overview of the studies?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Okay, great. Yeah, what motivated me for this dissertation was to really unpack this social class disparity. And so we asked people in open-ended questions, in the last 2 weeks, what actions have you taken that you believe contribute to society? And that turned up some actually relatively surprising responses. So I was just struck at how many people wrote about helping behaviors. And it could be anything from something really small, like holding open the door for someone else, to this really involved type of caregiving role that we've talked about. And so that really pointed me then in the direction of focusing on helping behaviors, and in trying to make sense of what dimension can we kind of delineate helping behavior to experimentally test. That's when we borrowed the bridging bonding distinction from social capital theory. So this is just a framework that we can use to kind of make sense of helping behaviors and categorize them. So we designated bridging help as help to someone who's outside of your immediate social network. So this is often like helping a stranger or someone that you're not familiar with, like volunteering is one example. Whereas bonding help is helping someone within your immediate social network, which is going to be someone like a close family member or a close friend. And so with that distinction, and there's some theoretical reasons why we thought that would be an important place to kind of draw this line between these two groups, we then ran some experiments where we showed participants, examples of helping behavior of someone, say Jamie, who helps their grandmother at a nursing home once a week, but then someone else, Taylor, does the exact same type of labor, but they help someone who they don't know. They just help a stranger at this nursing home. And we had people rate how they thought about these different helpers and the helping behavior. And we found that people consistently report that both of these actions are helpful, but the person who's helping a stranger is perceived as contributing more to society. They're perceived as more moral. And part of this is because they're perceived as having more of a choice to help that person. And so that it was kind of this next step in understanding, right, there's this social class disparity. We know from administrative data and past literature about different ways of helping others that can vary by social class. And then what we added to this picture through these experiments is, well, those behaviors are perceived differently in terms of how much they contribute to society.
And where do you think this choice comes? Is it because people have kind of I don't want to say like a requirement. I can't think of the word right now, but they have a responsibility to people in their social circles. So if you're not fulfilling that responsibility, maybe people aren't going to see that. But if you are fulfilling that responsibility, like seeing your grandmother in a facility, that's just something you're supposed to do. Is that kind of why that choice is there?
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head, that there's this very strong family obligation for so many reasons to be obligated and to have a responsibility and a commitment to our family members to care for each other. And there's some interesting work that actually neglecting that obligation is perceived as a big moral violation. So if I don't help my mom so I can instead help a stranger, that is not seen as morally virtuous at all. So it's almost this setup. We didn't test that specific type of setup in our experiments. It's almost a setup where you can only be a very moral, contributing, altruistic person if everyone who's in your immediate social network already has their needs met, and then you can go above and beyond to help someone else.
But then again, there are only so many hours in the day. So I think if, you're someone whose social circle has a lot of needs and, the 2 or 3 hours after work that you are available, if you're only helping, the people in your social circle, that's interesting because you may have to put a lot of work forward to do that minimum baseline. I know you said you didn't test that hypothesis, but future research, look at that. That's always future research, every study.
Always. And I think you exactly nailed it again, where it really then depends, and there's like structural societal differences in how much need people have. And a lot of that has to do with, economic inequality of if someone can get those needs met through other means, or if most of your extra time, as you were saying, is spent caring for those local others. Basically, like the need of the people in your local context, that is not uniformly distributed across people.
So we've talked about how people perceive their helping behaviors differently. Is this coming from the person who's doing the helping, or is it coming from like society as a whole or the people around you?
It's an excellent question that we kind of tried to address in a few different ways. So this feeling, the disparity, is coming from the person themselves. So it's people reporting on how much they believe they're contributing to society. We also asked meta perceptions. So how much do I think other people think I'm contributing to society? one thing for future research I'm excited about is getting the other perspective. So do people actually think that you're contributing less to society? So that's an open empirical question. But in terms of how these helping behaviors are perceived, most of our experiments are people judging other people's helping behavior, but we really wanted to know, well, maybe helpers themselves actually feel differently. Maybe they're not showing this bias towards helping distant others, and maybe they understand how important, some of this more local bonding help is. So in one of our correlational studies, we asked a number of people who were doing volunteering and family caregiving, and we found there that this same bias appears where people are thinking that the time they spend volunteering is contributing more to society than the time they spend caring for close others. So it's both through like an actor observer perspective, but also among helpers themselves.
Thanks for sharing that. So there are two things to this study. So one is the different types of helping behavior, but another component was people who are able to do these different types of behavior. So you talked about people in lower social classes are more commonly doing this bonding type of help, where it's helping people in your immediate social circle, where people in higher social classes are more available to do this bridging help, where you step outside of your circle, where you do something a little bit more visible. Why is this? So can you tell us how you categorize social classes and why you think this is?
Absolutely. So we take a social class in context approach. So really looking at the context and environments and situations that people navigate. And we focus there instead of on like individual characteristics or essential qualities of people. And that perspective being said, we still, we need a proxy for measuring those contexts. And a really useful one is education. Educational attainment. So it's been widely used in a number of different studies and shown to be really predictive of a host of different outcomes. But the way we differentiate is we say anyone with a 4-year college degree or more education is kind of coded as navigating a higher social class context. And then folks with less than a 4-year college degree, which is nearly 70% of the US population, somewhere between 60 and 70%, which always surprised a lot of folks in academia where we're interacting mostly with people who have that 4-year college degree. But they're coded as navigating a lower social class context. And so with that delineation, there's just a number of different reasons why these helping behaviors differ, and there's a few different literatures that speak to this. So let's take people in higher social class context, on average volunteering more. I do just want to note that these are trends. They're not prescriptives about specific individuals. People across the social class spectrum volunteer and do caregiving. But the way the trends work is it's more common in higher social class contexts. And that's everything from having more time availability, having more people who are in your social networks who volunteer, being more likely to be approached to engage in volunteering opportunities. So it's just, it's often like it's a resources perspective, but also just like a network perspective, why volunteering is more accessible in that context. And then the same kind of in the inverse way goes for why caregiving and this kind of close family caregiving tends to be more common in lower social class contexts. Some of that has to do, based on the literature, this is not what we tested, but I'm just kind of pointing to other folks' work here, has to do with who in your local context needs assistance, who needs help, and who can't meet those needs through other avenues, such as paid labor, such as home nurses or home health aides, and just the way that social class inequality and structural inequities work. People in lower social class contexts often have more health issues that need that extra assistance. And on top of that, it's there's some interesting social psychology work on networks in social class contexts and how people in lower social class contexts will have these kind of tighter, closer social networks where people are relying on each other for help, such as making small loans, driving each other to doctor's appointments, things like that. So it's, again, mostly I try to focus on the resource piece of it, but then there's also some kind of social network pieces to those different patterns as well.
So someone in a higher social class, I when I first read it, I thought about it in terms of maybe financial resources. So someone, if they have a family member who needs help, they have the resources to hire maybe a nurse who can come in every single day and do that job. But someone in a lower social class, they probably wouldn't be able to do that, right?
Exactly. That's exactly correct.
So what then once you got this information, how did you apply it? Because there are 5 studies in this one paper. So what I didn't realize at first is when someone publishes a paper, it can be conceptual, it can be theoretical, but it's not just one study that you did. It's 5 and really 6, right? Because your first one was like part A, part B. So do you want to talk about maybe some of the cooler aspects of the study? Because I think your 5th study used something called the Midas data source. Do you want to talk to us about that?
Would love to talk about Midas. So yes, the 5th study basically tied the 2 earlier pieces I was talking about together. So we had this social class disparity, and then we had kind of separately a second finding around how help is perceived. And so then we used this Midas correlational data set to try to understand if those 2 findings were related to each other. So Midas stands for the Midlife in the United States data set. It's a publicly available data set that was collected from 1995 to 2014. And there's a few different subsamples, but basically we had over 3,000 people in this sample that had answered questions related to their helping behaviors and their perceived social contribution. So what we did here is we looked at first the social class disparity, and we found again in this data set, as been previously reported, participants in lower social class contexts were reporting lower levels of that perceived social contribution. Then we looked at helping behaviors, and we found, kind of in line with past work and administrative data, that people in lower social class contexts were more likely to do unpaid family caregiving. So this question was asked participants, in the last month, how many hours on average have you spent helping out various groups? And we looked at the ones focused on family and close others. And so unpaid caregiving, more common among people in lower social class contexts. And then volunteering was more frequent in higher social class contexts. So then in this data set, we're finding these different trends. So then what we did is said, well, how is unpaid assistance for close others related to that feeling like you're contributing to society? And how is volunteering related? And so in the models we ran, both are positively related. So both of those aspects were, again, this is correlational, but helping others is related to feeling like you're doing something important for society. But critically, to answer our question here, volunteering showed a much stronger positive relationship. So the order of magnitude was about 5 times higher than the relationship of doing that unpaid labor for close others being related to feeling like you contribute. So then, armed with that finding, we were able to draw some more conclusions around the idea that, all right, this social class disparity is in part, related to the different helping behaviors that people engage in. And that's kind of what the study 5 added.
So I think that's fascinating. So, what would you have, something like 3,000 sample size?
Exactly. Yep. 3,000 participants. I'm a huge advocate for using this Midas data set. It's an incredible resource, just hundreds of measures included in this really rigorously collected sample. And so there's also MIDJA, which is midlife in Japan. So there's a cross-cultural comparison. So I just want to put a plug in for it's an incredible resource for researchers.
So you mentioned cross-cultural different samples. Is this something you looked at here, different demographic factors influencing this, different cultural factors? Because it seems like on average in the United States, that's something that you tested. But did you look at differences between male and female? Did you look at different regions in the United States? Did you look at maybe different racial groups?
All excellent avenues for future research that I am very eager to explore. So in all the correlational work, we control for age, gender, race, dichotomized marital status, because that's been shown to be related to this feeling of contributing, as well as working status. So if people are currently working or not. And basically we find, so obviously it holds with the controls or without the controls. And it's interesting in terms of people feeling like they contribute to society, age also correlates pretty strongly with that. So feeling when you're older, folks feel like they're contributing more to society. Gender is a little, it changes sometimes. If there is a gender difference, it's usually women who feel like they are contributing to society more so than men, but often that difference is inconsistent across different samples. And then working status is also related. So one avenue I'm interested in is how paid work is kind of a part of this whole picture. But what stood out to me was social class was far and away the strongest predictor of that feeling of contribution. So that's where we kind of followed where the data were pointing us there. And then in terms of looking at this across cultures, it's something I'm trained as a social and cultural psychologist. Hazel Marcus, my advisor, is a cultural psychologist. So we come at this from a very cultural perspective. And I just want to be really careful in bounding this to the United States. We only looked at the US, we looked at US Americans, and we have a lot of good theoretical reasons to believe this would not be true in other more interdependent, more collectivist cultures where helping family just has a different type of moral status, and there's different norms and expectations around the meaning behind that to society. So I am very eager to run a cross-cultural study and see how these processes play out in places beyond the US.
Well, just talking about the two samples, I think the one in Japan, there's kind of I don't know, stereotype's the right word, but in a lot of Asian cultures, they respect the elderly, the people who came before them a lot more maybe than in the United States. So it might be seen as more of something that they're feeling better about, where in the United States, maybe helping people maybe feeling like more of a burden. So I think that would be some really interesting findings to look at in the future.
Absolutely. Yep. I think those are an excellent framing for it. And I'm really excited to get those data at some point.
So what are the practical outcomes of this study? So you ran this big study, 6 of them actually. We see what the data says, but what are some of the practical implications of your work?
The practical implications, I think, so from the data we have now, this is still kind of in the early stages of this theory. But for me, so I'll speak kind of what I read from this work is I think it opens questions around what does it mean to value bonding help more? So we can get into what that might look like on a number of different levels, how institutions can do that. But I think this can even be at an everyday level of if someone is in a caretaking role or is helping someone with a need that they have, really understanding that that is a valuable action, that has meaning, that has value to people beyond just the person that you're helping. As one quick side note, I was so struck by the literature in social support that estimates unpaid family caregiving is valued at so this is unpaid labor for close others. That's, again, not paid, but if it were paid, it would be valued at over $470 billion annually. It's like our society would collapse if people didn't do this type of labor. And so I think at a practical level, just people who are doing this labor can live into the fact that it is such a contribution and what they're doing is really valuable and matters. I think that's one practical implication. I think there's a lot of other open questions around how to value that type of help kind of at a more cultural, institutional level as well.
And I've done work surrounding work-family balance. And one thing that I thought about when I first read this was, how does this apply to mothers? Because I feel like this would impact them a lot, because if you're someone who's, raising children and it's taking everything it can out of you, I know that some mothers feel like they aren't really doing anything because they've been, wrangling kids all day. And that's something I think would be really interesting to look at, is people who, you don't kind of have to do these things, working mothers, people who have elderly family members. It's just something that I think society needs to value more, because I think we all value when, helping and serving others. But obviously it's going to be a lot more prestigious if you donate a large sum of money or do something extra visible. So that's, personally why I thought your research was so interesting.
I appreciate that. And I completely agree. In some ways of thinking about as a species, like continuing our species, having children, raising good children, healthy, whole kids, that's a primary job of our species to continue. And the idea that raising kids is not respected or not as respected as it could be, or not as seen as contributing to society as it could be, I think there's a lot of room for growth on that front.
Mm-hmm. And I think your study, I don't want to say it puts a negative connotation on this relationship, because I think it should, different serving behaviors should be valued equally. But obviously from the data, we see that they're not. But could this be could there be positive aspects from this, saying if society does value these bridging behaviors more, could it push people to want to serve outside of their social circles? So I think we've talked about bridging behaviors and bonding behaviors as people are kind of in the buckets they're in because they're kind of forced to be there. But could the data here show that if you want to make a bigger contribution to society, maybe you should be pushed to do something outside of your immediate social circle?
That's so interesting. I actually I haven't really thought about it from that angle too much, but uh, one piece that comes to mind is there is a program I recently learned about that helps compensate people to volunteer. I I'll get some of the details of the I don't know the details of the program, but I think maybe that's speaking to this idea of if bridging is kind of has a societal value, we can change what's valued, but maybe at the same time, we can also be giving people more opportunities to do bridging help. So I think that could look like, um, even if it's just giving people time, paid time off of work to do that type of labor, that could be an interesting way to help people feel like they're, reaching outside of their social networks and able to do this type of pro-social behavior, or giving people where, taking a day off to go volunteer isn't feasible, but if they got paid the same amount as if they were working, then they could take that day off to go volunteer. I think it's interesting, and it opens a lot of questions around how would incentivizing, for example, that type of labor change maybe how it's perceived or change how it feels. So I think there's a lot more to uncover there.
Mm-hmm. So your dissertation's done. You probably finished this a couple years ago. You went through the dissertation process, then you went into submitting it to journals. So there's been a lot of work, I'm sure, that's been done by you after this study. So what comes next? What are you working on now?
I am interested in building on this in a few different ways. So one of the pieces why I'm really excited to be in a communication department, as I mentioned, is around how this value is communicated. So I'm interested in one specific instance of this, which is when colleges and universities recruit students or advertise to students who might be applying to their programs. And it's this interesting time where for a lot of these colleges, students have to pitch themselves to a university. This is what I've done. These are my grades. This is what I've contributed through extracurriculars, for example. And I was looking at some websites on the kind of what we're looking for section of the admission pages and found there was some variability in how schools framed contributions. So, for example, one school said, all right, you maybe had some family obligations. What will you do once you're here and you no longer have those obligations? And it was such an interesting framing to me. I will note that this school has since changed their website. So that was a few years ago. But it just treated family obligations as kind of irrelevant to what the student might be able to contribute to this new community. And there's a different school that said, maybe you held down a job, maybe you helped take care of a family member or babysat a little, a sibling. Those are just as important as volunteering or doing some other type of extracurricular. We want to hear about that. What was your experience like? What leadership skills did you gain? Tell us about those. And so I am really interested in understanding how some of these organizational messages can kind of embody or go against this preference for bridging help over bonding help, what that means for students who are looking at those schools and for students who apply and maybe even get in. How does that affect if they feel like they belong and they're a part of that community or not? And that could have potentially some important implications for first generation students or students from more non-traditional backgrounds. So that's one piece I'm interested in. I'm also interested in exploring this feeling of contribution as it relates to kind of like a broader sense of belonging and inclusion in society. I think there's a lot of rightful concern around our kind of greater US culture and feeling like people on different sides and we're disintegrated. Is there a way to help people feel like they're contributing in something important and they are a part of this larger whole? So like, what are some of those relationships and those connections there?
Mm-hmm. I think that's so funny. I'm sure the person who put that first college you talked about, I'm sure they didn't mean it in a negative way, but the way that you said it and the way that people read it, it was probably like, well, when you're done, helping your family, come do something important at our college, at our university. So, I think the second messaging, how, helping behaviors, however you do it, are particularly valued. But you started talking about organizational messaging. So in an email when we were setting up this interview, I told you that I was interested in applying this to the business world. So in any job that you have, there's something called task performance. Essentially, you have a job. If you complete that job, if you do what you're supposed to, if you check all your boxes, you have good task performance. But there's something called organizational citizenship behavior where you go above and beyond. And that can be directed toward the organization as a whole, or that could be directed towards other individuals. And I thought that we could take kind of this study that you had of bridging help and bonding help and apply this to the business world. So there's been some stuff done about this, but I thought that we could apply this to maybe different forms of help because, you know, some people do help because they're naturally altruistic and want to help people. People naturally have pro-social behavior because they want to help people, but other people may want to do this because they want to be seen helping people. So maybe it's not so much that you're forced to help people, like you have someone in your social circle needs help, but maybe you just want to do that so I can get a promotion, so I can get a raise. So I think that's would be a fascinating study to apply to the organizational behavior business realm. I think this has a lot of different derivatives that we could take. And that's just something I came up from my point of view.
I think that's so interesting and definitely research that needs to be done. And there is some studies suggesting, like you said, that we know that the motivation to help really, or the perceived motivation really impacts how that pro-social behavior is perceived. And there's kind of this idea of this pure altruism of it's a sacrifice made with no self-interest at all, that's kind of this ideal way of helping others. I think some of the work we've been talking about tries to kind of question and draw out some of the implications of that perspective. But I think you're so right. In an organizational context, there's a lot that could be learned from understanding kind of who is the help for these behaviors. Is it for a close colleague? Is it for your boss, where maybe someone could think that your motive is ulterior or tainted because you're maybe wanting a promotion? And is that necessarily useful if you're still doing good work that goes above and beyond? Does the motive actually matter? So I think there's a lot of interesting questions that could be unpacked with some of those studies.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of work on, how does one's perception deal with the reality of what someone's doing. So there has been a lot of work touching on this area, but this is something I want to flesh out a little bit more and look at because I just thought it was a really interesting work. So we've been talking for a while, but as we're closing, what else really interesting are you working on? What is something that you're looking forward for the future with your work?
Oh, that's so interesting. Are you thinking of something beyond this kind of contribution focus, or just anything broadly? Okay.
It's just anything broadly, yeah.
That is so interesting. I am so laser focused on who contributes and why they feel like they contribute. Most of my research kind of centers in that area. And I think one avenue I'm very interested in that kind of deviates maybe a bit from this work is if we were to change this perspective and give more credit to caregiving, that might take a lot of different forms. So it might have nothing to do with any explicit message around a sense of contributing to caregiving. I think it may, but there's also, I learned about some really interesting programs here at Michigan State that, for example, are combating ageism by pairing undergraduates with older folks in the community to develop these relationships. And people just have the most glowing responses to this program. And so I think I'm really interested in just understanding how do we combat this perspective and change it. And that might look like something kind of different than we would expect. So it might look like fostering relationships with people who are different than you. And if you know someone who's older, who's not your grandparent, for example, then maybe caregiving is seen differently. I just think, I'm just excited at kind of tackling. I'm just very interested in this area. So I'm not really trying to move outside of this area, but that answering these questions might mean drawing on a lot of different types of answers to try to move the needle on it.
So this is a question that I ask everyone. So you're someone who's attained a degree of professional success. You've gone from Ohio to Pennsylvania to California, postdoc, PhD. all that. What advice do you have for someone if they are trying to be successful in life? Usually I ask successful in career, but because you're a social psychologist, because you're someone who's, in a slightly different field, what advice do you have for someone if they're trying to be successful in life?
What a beautiful question. I think that is so great and so lofty, and I want to be cautious around offering advice when I feel very much like I am still on the journey and figuring things out. The the first thing that comes to me is, and this might be cliche, but it's just taking a little bit of time as often as you can to slow down and just to reflect on the important relationships in your life. And I'll put this in first perspective. I feel best. I feel most grounded. I feel most connected to the people I love and my communities when I can take a beat to reflect. Whether that means reading a Mary Oliver poem, or that means playing with my cats or my dog, and just slowing down and taking that beat, because I think on this path it can be really just intense and there's always something else to do. And I've spent years kind of caught up in that hamster wheel. And the more I pause and stop and slow down, even if it's just for a few minutes, that has really just helped me stay grounded and then also stay focused in what direction I want to be pointed in, and making sure I'm kind of headed on the towards the place that I want to end up. So that's, I don't know if you get responses like that, if that's maybe on the cliche side, but for me personally, that has been really helpful. And that's something I hope to continue to cultivate moving forward.
I think that's wonderful. So it sounds like a lot of your academic research aligns with kind of your priority is just like slow down. We're okay. What we're doing is good.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's wonderful. Thanks for sharing.
Am I asked, wait, if you had to answer that question, what's some advice you would give folks?
Oh, that's hard. No one's ever turned it back on me. That's cheating.
I'm just genuinely curious. I'd love your perspective.
Something I tell my students, kind of my motto as a teacher is I want to help students get high paying, meaningful jobs. So meaningfulness is really important to me. Um, you can have a job where, you get paid well, but if you just don't enjoy what you're doing, it's going to be hard. But there's the other end of the spectrum where people say, if you have a job you love, you're never going to work a day in your life. I don't think that's true either. But I think finding things that make life meaningful is what's important. So that's, that can be family, that can be religion, that can be your work, that can be a lot of different things. And it can be the interaction of all those things as well. But I think doing something that kind of fulfills you as a person is going to be most important. And I think there are also times in your life where that's going to be different. So if you're at a point in your life where you're focusing on your career, dive into that and get meaning from that. But maybe if you're focusing more on family, maybe some of these other avenues need to pull back. But meaningfulness is very important to me as a person, because I'm someone who I've been lucky that in my career, I've been able to accomplish the jobs that I've had. But the times that I've struggled the most is where I feel overwhelmed, or where I feel like what I'm doing isn't making a difference. So if I were to wake up and just feel like, what am I doing? Why am I here? Kind of this idea of like, if I'm just doing bonding help, I'm just doing like what I'm supposed to do. But
Mm-hmm.
making your life meaningful, but also keeping your head down and pushing through, even if it isn't, even if it's just a hard time, maybe your comprehensive exams, or maybe life's just hard, but try to inject meaning where you can.
I think that is some stunning advice, and uh, I think ours are maybe related too. Sometimes, like, the pausing is what helps me make meaning and understand or recognize the meaning that's there. And so, I think that's excellent.
And I think as academics, that's a unique problem, because um, a lot of times you will submit a article and it'll take a year or plus before it gets published. But before that, there was study one, there was study two. This result didn't pan out, so we had to change this. There's a lot of work. So the gratification that you get from a job well done is oftentimes delayed, and I think that delay makes it so it's not completed at all. So maybe you had this, amazing study, you send it to one journal, they rejected it. You send it to another, there's a revise, resubmit, 1-2 submissions, maybe you have to add a study. So by the time you take this work that you've done, you're 2 or 3 years down the road, and it's like, phew, almost like okay, we got it out there, rather than woohoo, look what I did.
Exactly. It's just relief that the process is over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I'd be curious your experience, but for me, then so much of that meaning comes from community and from my
Mm-hmm.
collaborators and folks who can celebrate the work before it gets that kind of external stamp of validation. That's what's made it possible to keep going when
Yeah.
it is a long, long road.
Yeah, but they're also different types. So I think some academics are more research focused, some are more teaching focused. I'm at a more balanced school, so I kind of get that teaching and research focused. And I know you're going to be teaching next semester, but you're at a postdoc. Obviously, you're going to be a little bit more research focused. But there's a lot of different types, and that's something we could talk about in a different conversation. But yeah, I think we're similar in terms of slowing down, meaning, and just what we're doing. We're doing good. So.
I think that's right.
All right, Dr. Ellen Reinhart, if people want to check out more of your work, where do they find you?
The paper and my publications are on Google Scholar. I've
Mm,
got a Twitter account where I tried to summarize some of the paper, so feel free to find me there or email me. My information is available on Michigan State's communication website.
wonderful. I wanted to thank you so much for coming on the Psychology of Business podcast.
Thank you. I had such a delight getting to talk more about these ideas, and just thanks so much for a great conversation.
Wonderful. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. You have a great day and happy learning. We'll see you next time.